We are back, and we are joined now by Christoph Vogel, author of Conflict Minerals Incorporated, War, Profit, and White Saviourism in Eastern Congo, award-winning researcher of Central Africa, research director at the Insecure Livelihoods Project at Ghent University. Christoph, thanks so much for coming on the program today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, I've been reading some of what you've written, and it's striking how different your work is versus what I normally read in Western coverage of violence in the Congo, which is often filled with a lot of vague language, a fallback on kind of a tendency to view it as an ethnic conflict or a conflict over resources. Gangs are discussed without context of how they place in society. And, I guess as an academic who's studied this and who's done so much field work in Congo for many years, what are the gaps that the Western coverage of this is showing? And what is really kind of the reality, if you could fill in that basically information dead zone for our audience?
Well, so I think in general there's a long-standing problem in the way that the rest of the world, especially the Western world, has been sort of trying to make sense of a place like Congo, and that starts long ago. If you go back to sort of colonial newspapers, in which some of the still dominant stereotypes about the Congo have been sort of nourished and created since a long time. You see that actually much of Western reporting and Western narratives that exist about that place in the world tells us at the end much more about these observers than about the Congo itself. And that then sort of can be articulated in a number of tropes. So there is sort of a predominant pattern of depoliticizing conflicts, not just in the Congo, but also in other sort of remote or so-called peripheral places in the world. And that pattern of depoliticizing things is quite manifest in some of the classic narratives about why wars have started and keep going on in a place like Eastern Congo. And that is often linked then to stereotypes about so-called ethnic tensions. Now, they do exist, and they sometimes sort of flare up in more spectacular ways, in some moments more than in others. But one thing where sort of much of the international reporting tends to be a little bit lazy and sort of bent on shortcuts rather than analysis is that very often as violence plays out perhaps along ethnic lines, it is deep-seated political issues, political tensions, political fights and conflicts that are then sort of erupting in violence, and where then sort of belonging, identity, and other questions are basically being mobilized in order to sort of promote certain political agendas.
So it's often a depoliticization. I think you see this as well in the coverage of the Middle East, and a removal of rationality or of like a kind of power analysis that makes sense, where you can fall back on, well, these are just tribes, this is intra-warfare, or this is terrorism, as opposed to the same analysis that would be applied to like a Western government. You don't necessarily see that very often. And about the resources and how resource rich Congo is. I know you wrote a book about this. What is the reality of the exploitation of those resources as it relates to the multi-decade conflict in Congo and the recent uptick in very severe violence over the past few months?
So yeah, that's adding to sort of the ethnic trope. The resource trope is a second kind of very popular and initially sort of Western-inspired lens to see conflict. Now, that trope is still very powerful, especially now as the flashlights are again on Eastern Congo, as conflicts have intensified over the past months and years. There's somehow a revival of this idea that everything in this war would be motivated by resources, which is historically untrue. So I always like to sort of go back to two more ancient examples. So we see that some of the first cases of massive cross-border mineral smuggling, in that case gold, came up in the 1970s when basically some of the communities and also trading networks that were operating around a series of rich gold mines in the east just decided that given all the red tape and also sort of encroachment of the central government, it would be much more interesting for them to start exporting via Uganda, from where the gold would then end up in all sorts of places in the world. So that is sort of highlight that the smuggling itself, or sort of the illegal, informal forms of trade, doesn't necessitate the use of armed violence in order to function. Rather, as some recent research that Congolese colleagues and I did a couple of years ago, if you talk to sort of all these magnates in the unofficial gold trade, they will tell you that it's actually much harder to sort of organize some lucrative smuggling deals when there is violence and shooting all around. The second moment in time is if we look back to the start of the actual wars, which is roughly around 93, 94, when there was already a number of violent conflicts on a more local level on the Congolese, or what was then the Zairian side of the border, that sort of got merged with the impact of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda 94, when the perpetrators flew into Eastern Congo, and some of them still remain today in Eastern Congo. At that point, none of the belligerents relied on natural resources to finance their war. That all came 5 years, which is a very long period, into sort of more or less intense conflicts.
And so you mentioned that period and the 90s, I guess, as a time where I believe that was when, and maybe you're definitely someone who could answer this for me. When did Zaire become the DRC? What year was that?
So that was in 1997, after a roughly 1.5 years war, in which a rebellion called the AFDL, that was led by Laurent Kabila, managed to topple Mobutu with the support of a large number of
Gotcha.
neighboring governments.
And Mobutu, if you could explain his role as a bit of a butler for the West, and I know he was supportive of apartheid South Africa as well. What was Western involvement in Congo leading up to that point? So in order to answer that question, we need to definitely go back to Patrice Lumumba, who was the Congo's the first prime minister of the independent Congo after decolonization in 1960. And Patrice Lumumba had only spent a couple of months being the prime minister, but had quite a massive impact on sort of the history of politics in the country until today, especially given the fact that he was killed with active support of American, Belgian, and perhaps other Western intelligence services, and also with the support of Mobutu, who was back then one of his close aides and previously a high-ranking military officer. And Mobutu was the sort of
the strong man in waiting that was ready to sort of take over power across all of Congo back then and keep it for 32 years, in which he sort of established this mutually beneficial relationship of him getting quite strong political backing, especially from the US as well as France and a number of other countries, in response precisely to sort of serving as a bit of a Western liberal pillar against most notably those countries that had closer ties to the Soviet Union back then. So, for instance, Mobutu hosted Angolan, West-leaning Angolan rebels that were fighting a war in the 70s and 80s against the Angolan government.
So, understood there. So essentially he positioned himself as an anti-communist, and that won a bit of the favor of the West. Did he also open up avenues for even further colonial exploitation?
That's a bit more complicated to to judge upon. So Mobutu had this very intriguing governance technique, perhaps, that he sort of would rely on a broadly very anti-colonial Pan-Africanist rhetoric, and he also nationalized. In the early 70s, as the country was renamed Zaire, he nationalized a large list of sort of previously colonially owned corporations and companies in order to create parastatal outfits, including Congo's most important mining company, which is called GECAMIN, which is a bit sort of the offspring of what used to be sort of the main Belgian colonial mining company. But then he also sort of engaged in a sort of joint venture-like approach to sort of together with foreign investors to exploit notably the big mineral reserves in terms of copper and other substances in the southern parts, where also the uranium that was used for the nuclear bombings in Japan originally came from.
And so from that point on, you meant the Rwandan genocide happened, of course, in the 90s. What did that do to the region and the political reality within Congo as well?
So in a nutshell, it basically led to 3 decades and going of more or less intense wars, insecurity, displacement, and fighting. People often sort of split this sort of whole history of violent breakdown since the early 90s into 3 periods. The first war that we spoke about that toppled Mobutu in 97, and then from 98 to 2003, there was, well, it was always kind of a concoction of numerous conflicts, where also localized conflicts sort of play into the bigger national or regional fault lines as well. But that period is called the Second Congo War, and that basically started when Laurent Kabila sent away his previous backers that helped him to topple Mobutu, and that led to a situation where both in Eastern Congo at the local level, different armed groups and militias would rally either the government or a new rebel group that was backed again by a number of neighboring countries, while other countries in the region were also backing the central government under Kabila. Now that war had its official formal end after a series of national and international peace negotiations around 2003, when Laurent Kabila had already been assassinated a couple of years ago, and his son Joseph Kabila had taken over the presidency. And so under Joseph Kabila, there was sort of a reunification of a country that was for several years split de facto between different rebel movements and their respective backers. And then we see the creation of a new national army in 2004, and a number of different political processes, most notably the organization of the country's first democratic election in 2006. However, despite the fact that sort of the broader regional tensions have ebbed down a little bit after that period, we also see, owing to the integration of most of the former rebel movements into the national army with their respective claims and grievances, we see a very unstable political and security environment that has always led, then again, certain actors to sort of defect and then create new rebel organizations that would again try to challenge the central power, such as the CNDP rebellion between 2005 and 2008, or then more recently the M23 rebellion that had its first stint from 2012 and 13 and returned to the battlefield in 2021. And all of this happened in a context where you've had consistently dozens, if not up to 100 other different armed groups spread all across the eastern part with their respective agendas and objectives, sometimes collaborating with central government forces, sometimes not, but equally contributing to a record number of internally displaced people that has reached, according to the UN, up to 7 million as we speak.
And so I guess that does bring us to the present day. You talked about those millions displaced. How many have died, and what are the kind of groups that are at the forefront of driving some of this instability?
So there is intense speculation, if not polemic, about specific counts of victims. There have been a couple of efforts to extrapolate more or less reliable numbers. As a proper sort of forensic count is nearly impossible, especially over space and time. One of the most famous numbers that came out fairly early after the Second Congo War was that up to 6 million people might have died from the wars. Now that was seen, especially also in sort of more simplified takes, as if different rebel movements, gangs, and armies would have literally killed 6 million people, which is not true, because that figure sort of also counts secondary victims, which are very probably much higher number than actual battlefield victims. And you have to imagine that in a sense that where there is recurrent fighting, people are getting displaced. Many people, sometimes even displaced people, get further displaced a second, a third, or a fourth time. And that happens amidst a situation where insecurity, violence, but also bad governance, corruption, and interference of different conflict parties lead to a situation where a healthcare system, which is already in normal times struggling to sort of provide sufficient services to the population, gets completely destroyed. The agricultural sector is suffering enormously from displacement, where a majority of basically farming people just cannot attend to their harvest anymore as they get displaced. And so you've got got all ingredients to sort of lead to what maybe medical professionals would call unnatural or untimely cases of death, and to sort of number all of these indirect victims is a task that sort of is scientifically extremely difficult, but then again is a question that is often picked up in very polemic and partisan debates, where supporters of different of the conflict parties involved keep accusing each other of inflating or reducing numbers, and that leading also to a much more polarized invective that sort of accompanies the actual fighting on social media as well as traditional media.
And so I guess that kind of brings us full circle to some of the root causes of what we're seeing as well. And the obviously the history of colonialism and the role of mining in this conflict. I know that you spoke about how it's basically a Western trope, essentially, how to reduce it to a war over resources. But there is something notable that I saw in your writing, how I'll see in, say, like a CNN article about this, where it's referred to illegal mining within Congo versus informal mining, and how that's referred to there. What is the role of mining in this conflict, I guess, not in the sense of a war over resources, but how the industry plays into it within Eastern Congo's economy specifically?
So mining obviously has a quite important role alongside and in the conflicts, and as much as the role of resources, or the plunder or the violent accumulation of resources, has been sort of wrongly elevated into sort of the main or only driver of conflict, you do see that the natural resources are very important. They're important in discourse. So Congolese discourse, whether it's parts of the population, whether it's the government, thrives enormously on the supposed theft of Congolese minerals by neighboring countries or by rebel groups, and there is, of course, also a sort of a broader economy in the Congo, where different forms of mining, so different substances, different technical forms of industrial or artisanal mining, are enormously important for the national economy as much as for livelihoods. Cobalt and copper remain the country's biggest exports, although those minerals are not being mined in the conflict area, and in that context we see much more problems of grant corruption with multinational corporations cutting shady deals with national mining elites, as well as very obvious labor safety and ecological issues. Now, if we go sort of a bit more to a very nitty-gritty local level and back to sort of the eastern provinces that are most affected by conflict, there is other minerals being mined primarily, which are, for instance, coltan, tin, and tungsten. And those minerals are mainly mined artisanally. So that means artisanal mining is a labor-intensive activity, and the sort of the boom of those mines has been, on the one side, pushed by international demand for certain rare minerals. On the other side, it's also been favored precisely by war-induced displacement, since artisanal mining is a fairly unskilled, a fairly mobile activity. It has a number of, and very similar to recruitment into armed groups, that is equally a form of mobile labor for a lot of the younger population. So that has sort of led to a perfect storm that turned artisanal mining into both a key civilian livelihood as well as a potential resource for conflict actors to prey upon. Now, and here's where the sort of depoliticization comes in again. Many of the sort of early early 2000s Western advocacy organizations that singled out mining as the root cause for violence and conflict in Eastern Congo, didn't really sort of allow an image where basically different actors in Congo are fighting out a number of deep political historical issues. But they basically saw that some of them went into mining and made quick cash through mining, and so they thought it's all about minerals. Now, what we see in the last years, and having a closer look at a number of the different rebel groups and factions fighting, we see that those based out of an area where there is just a couple of juicy mines nearby will, if it is practical and easy for them, obviously rely on income or revenue from mining in order to finance their war effort. But then we have a number of other groups that rely on completely different types of resources. And one interesting example is the Congolese army itself. While it has been involved in militarized forms of mining over time, it still has the most pervasive economic impact in terms of the sort of system of hundreds and hundreds of roadblocks and checkpoints that it operates through the country, where it's taxing movement of people, movement of goods, and so do many other armed groups as well. So it is in the end not about necessarily just this easy idea of African people being merely greedy and having no political thought, no political agenda of their own. It is much more a story where you look at fairly pragmatic actors that will be trying to advance their agendas with the means and strategies that are at hand, and that questions also sort of more largely our Western view of allowing in the way we analyze things only one type of rationality, which is the one that we decide to sort of read in the actions of others, rather than sort of understanding, developing sort of the same fine-grained understanding that we like to apply when analyzing our own politics.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, Christoph Vogel. You can read his book, Conflict Minerals Incorporated, War, Profit, and White Saviourism in Eastern Congo. Thanks so much for your time today and helping unpack this for us.
Thank you.